Hello Year 2s, it's lovely to see you all. So yesterday, when we read the BFG, we read a chapter all about the snozcumbers. Oh, and they were absolutely disgusting. Now, I had a job to do, and that was to find out what a word meant that I found very, very tricky to read. And the word was, let me find it. It was perambulator, a perambulator. And I couldn't believe it when I found this out. A perambulator is just a pram. Like a pram that you'd put a baby in, that you'd push around, but its actual full name is a perambulator. So I thought that was rather interesting. Today, we are going to be reading chapter 9, and it is the Bloodbottler. Now, this chapter is quite long, so make sure you're nice and comfy. Okay. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, "Runt! Is that you there, Runt? I hear you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt?" "Look out," cried the BFG. "It's the Bloodbottler." But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall and as wide as the BFG, can you imagine that, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous pearly-eaten snozcumber was lying near her. She ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. "Who was you jabbling to in here just now?" he boomed. "I is jabbling to myself," the BFG answered. "Piffle fizz," shouted the Bloodbottler. "Bugs wallop," he boomed. "You is talking to a human being. That's what I is thinking." "No, no," cried the BFG. "Yes, yes," boomed the Bloodbottler. "I is guessing you has snitched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper." The poor BFG was very nervous. "There's no one in here," he stammered. "Why don't you leave me alone?" The Bloodbottler pointed a finger as large as a tree trunk at the BFG. "Runty little scrum skewer," he shouted. "Piffling little swish fingler. Squimpy little bottlewort. Pruny little pogs whizzler. I is now going to search the primroses." He grabbed the BFG by the arm. "And you is going to help me do it. Us together is going to winkle out this tasteful little human being," he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back. But now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous snozcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The Bloodbottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish pink. There was a black hair sprouting on his chest and arms and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squashy looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost ear to ear, and it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters lying one on top of the other. Craggy yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankenfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down over the chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The Bloodbottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles. "You and your piping bottles," he shouted. "What is you putting in them?" "Nothing that would interest you," said the BFG. "You is only interested in guzzling human beings, and you is dotty as dog's waller. cried the blood bottler. Soon the blood-bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She'd break her leg. The snozzcumber, although, was as thick as a perambulator, we know that word now, was not going to hide her, even if the blood-bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed end of it. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy flesh. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away 6 of these seeds. This left a hole right in the middle of the snozzcumber, large enough for her to crouch in so long as she rolled herself into a ball. She crawled into it. It was wet and slimy. But what did that matter if that was going to save her from being eaten? The blood-bottler and the BFG were coming back towards the table now, the BFG nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the blood-bottler grabbed the half-eaten snozzcumber. The BFG stared at the bed table. Sophie? Where is you? He thought desperately. You cannot possibly be jumping off that high table, so where are you hiding, Sophie? So, this is the filthy, rotsome glubbage you is eating, boomed the blood-bottler, holding up the partly eaten snozzcumber. You must be cockles to be guzzling such rub-squash. For a moment, the blood-bottler seemed to have forgotten about his search for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track. That is the scrumdiddlyumptious snozzcumber, he said. I is guzzling that gleefully every night and day. Is you ever trying a snozzcumber, blood-bottler? Human beans is juicier, the blood-bottler said. You is talking rummy trot, the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood-bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavour would send him bellowing out of the cave. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on, but please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchit for my supper. The blood-bottler stared suspiciously, with small piggy eyes at the snozzcumber. Sophie, crouching inside the chewed-off end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-fiddling me, is you? Said the blood-bottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and I am positive you will be shouting about how scrumdiddlyumptious this wonder veg is. The BFG could see the greedy blood-bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It is not healthsome always to be eating meaty things. Just this once, the blood-bottler said. I is going to taste these rotsome eats of yours. But I is warning you that if it is filthsome, I is smashing it over your sludgy little head. He picked up the snozzcumber. He began raising it on its long journey to his mouth. Some filthy feet up in the air. Oh, some 50 feet up in the air, not filthy. Sophie wanted to scream, don't! But that would have been an even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up and up. Suddenly, there was a crunch as the blood-bottler bit a huge hunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clamping together a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch some more. She prayed that she would be killed quickly. Roared the blood-bottler. Oh, ew! And then he spat. All of the great lumps of snozzcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie herself, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft folds of the BFG's black cloak hanging against the wall. She dropped to the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. "You little swine bugler," roared the Bloodbottler. "You little pig swiller." He rushed at the BFG and smashed what was left of the snozzcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable smashed all over the cave. "You is not loving it," the BFG said innocently, rubbing his head. "Loving it?" yelled the Bloodbottler. "That is the most disgustorous taste that is ever clutching my teeth. You must be buggles to be swalloping sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping off, happy as a hamburger, and gobbling juicy human beans." "Eating human beans is wrong and evil," the BFG said. "It is guzzly and glumptious," shouted the Bloodbottler. "And tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few human chili beans. Is you wishing to know why I is choosing Chile?" "I is not wishing to know anything," the BFG said, very dignified. "I is choosing Chile," the Bloodbottler said, "because I is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important I has plenty of cold eats in this scuddling hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Eskimo is a chili bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly." "Horrible," the BFG said. "You ought to be ashamed. Other giants is all saying they's wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school childers," the Bloodbottler said. "I is very fond indeed of English school childers. They has a nice inky booky flavour. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them instead." "You is disgusting," the BFG said. "And you is an insult to the giant peoples," shouted the Bloodbottler. "You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squinky little squiddler. You is a pibbling little pitsqueak. You is a cream puffnut." With that, the horrible blood-bottling giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. "Sophie," he whispered. "Sophie, where is you, Sophie?" Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. "I'm here," she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. "Oh, I is so happy to be finding you all in one lump," he said. "I was in his mouth," Sophie said. "You was what?" cried the BFG. Sophie told him what had happened. "And there I was, telling him to eat that filth from snozzcumber, and you was all the time inside it," the BFG cried. "Not much fun," Sophie said. "Just look at you, you poor little chiddler," cried the BFG. "You is all covered in snozzcumber and giant spit." He set about cleaning her up as best he could. "I is hating those other giants more than ever now," he said. "You know what I should like?" "What?" Sophie said. "I should like to find a way of disappearing them, every single one." "Well, I'd be glad to help you," Sophie said. "Let me see if I can't think up a way of doing it." That is our chapter for today. Tomorrow we'll be on chapter 10. And chapter 10 is about Frobscottle and Whizpoppers. I wonder what that one is going to be about. I will see you tomorrow, everybody, for another story time. Goodbye.